On the morning of January 17, 1920, America didn't just lose its bars, it lost its memory. And that forgetting wasn't an accident, it was strategic. The government didn't just criminalize alcohol, they criminalized the knowledge systems that kept communities functioning. And here's the part nobody talks about. They did it by making sure no official records survived explaining what people had lost. This is the story of how Prohibition didn't just turn ordinary survival skills into felonies. It turned the people who knew those skills into ghosts in their own country. When the Volstead Act passed, it came with something most people never noticed: a deliberate erasure protocol. Local sheriffs weren't supposed to keep detailed records of what people were arrested for. Bootleggers weren't supposed to leave behind recipes or instructions. Grandmothers weren't supposed to write down the remedies they'd been making for decades. The government understood something that modern compliance departments would recognize instantly: knowledge that exists only in oral tradition, in practiced hands, in grandmother's memory, is knowledge you can't regulate. So they didn't try to regulate it. They just made the practice of it punishable enough that the knowledge died with the generation that held it. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Before 1920, a rural woman's knowledge of fermentation, which foods lasted the winter, how to read temperature by touch, when salt ratios worked versus when they failed. That knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was survival infrastructure. Entire seasons depended on it. When that knowledge suddenly became dangerous to practice openly, it didn't disappear, but it did something worse. It fragmented. Some of it died because the person who held it died before they could pass it on. Some of it got garbled because it had to be transmitted in whispers instead of demonstrations. Some of it survived but got locked away, hidden in families who were terrified to even acknowledge they still had it. The Prohibition era had 25 major survival tricks, yes. But the story isn't really about those 25 specific things. It's about what happened when the government decided that survival knowledge itself was a threat. And because we're talking about the angle nobody explores, we need to understand the mechanism. The government didn't need to understand fermentation chemistry to criminalize it. They just needed to understand human fear. And fear works faster than regulation. A bootlegger who got arrested didn't just lose income. He lost credibility with his children. He couldn't teach his son the craft without endangering him. A woman who'd been preserving food for 40 years suddenly became a liability to her own family if she tried to share those skills. What makes this angle unique is understanding that Prohibition didn't just criminalize actions. It criminalized the transmission of knowledge. And that's far more effective because it happens inside families, inside trust structures, inside the moments where real learning happens. You can't arrest a feeling of guilt. You can't criminalize a grandmother's fear for her grandchildren's safety, but you can engineer the conditions where both of those things make sure certain knowledge never gets shared again. Let's dig into how this actually played out in 5 specific ways that most historical accounts completely skip over. And I've gone deeper into the psychological and strategic architecture of this in the pinned comment. Check that out if you want the full documentation on how governments use criminalization to break knowledge transmission chains. Number 1. The deliberate destruction of instructional materials. Before 1920, agricultural extension offices published manuals on food preservation. State bulletins explained canning, fermentation, aging, and curing in precise technical detail. Some of these were reprinted from government sources. As soon as Prohibition passed, these materials got weird. New editions removed exact instructions. They described processes but left out critical details that made them actually work. A woman who'd learned from a 1918 manual could teach others. A woman with the 1921 edition was stuck. She knew what fermentation looked like, but the specific temperature ranges, the salt calculations, the aging periods, those got vague. This wasn't accidental editing. It was precision deletion. It's the reason grandmothers had to learn from grandmothers, not from government pamphlets. Because once you criminalize a practice, the government stops helping people learn it safely. Number 2. The poisoning of knowledge itself. This is genuinely dark, and it's documented. The government knew people would keep making alcohol illegally, so they decided the way to stop them was to contaminate the supply. Starting in 1926, federal agents added industrial poisons to commercial alcohol supplies that bootleggers could access. Methanol, kerosene, formaldehyde. Thousands of people died. But here's what people don't connect to this. The poisoning campaign didn't just kill people. It destroyed trust in the knowledge that had kept Americans safe for generations. Before 1926, if you knew how to make alcohol, you had probably made it safely. Your family had been doing it for a century. Suddenly, federal poisoning made home production seem lethal. The government didn't have to ban knowledge of fermentation. They just had to make people believe that fermentation could now kill them. And guess what? That fear worked better than any law ever could. Number 3. Criminalizing the teacher, not the student. This is subtle but absolutely crucial to understanding how knowledge gets erased. When a bootlegger got arrested, the charge was usually for production or distribution. But in some jurisdictions, there was a secondary charge that almost never gets discussed: corrupting youth. If you were teaching a young person how to make alcohol, you weren't just committing a felony. You were committing a crime against the moral development of the next generation. This charge existed specifically to terrify older people into silence. It didn't matter if you were teaching your son, your apprentice, your family member. The implication was that passing on this knowledge was child endangerment. And that's why so many skills genuinely did die out. Not because people forgot how to do them, but because the social cost of teaching them became unbearable. Number 4. The creation of knowledge scarcity through arrest records. Once someone got arrested for bootlegging, their arrest became public record. In small towns, everyone knew. And once you were known as someone who made alcohol, you couldn't just go back to being an ordinary farmer or tradesman. You became marked. Your reputation preceded you. This meant that the people who had the most advanced knowledge of fermentation, preservation, and distillation, they couldn't openly consult with younger people because it would draw attention. A master brewer in 1920 becomes a legal liability in 1921. His knowledge is valuable, but sharing it could destroy his family's economic survival. So he doesn't teach, he doesn't consult, he doesn't write things down. The knowledge lives inside one head and dies with him. Number 5. The reorganization of family structure around secrecy. This is the most insidious effect and the least talked about. Before 1920, knowledge transfer was normal. A father taught a son a craft, a mother taught a daughter recipes, a master taught an apprentice. These relationships were open and acknowledged. Prohibition forced them underground. Now knowledge had to be transmitted in secret. That changes the entire dynamic of how skills get learned. Instead of careful demonstration and patient practice, you get rushed, whispered instructions. Instead of mentorship, you get conspiracy. Instead of pride and mastery, you get shame and secrecy. And here's what's critical. Knowledge transmitted in fear isn't the same knowledge. Details get lost, mistakes get made, and most importantly, the next generation becomes trained to hide rather than share. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, an entire generation of young people had learned that certain knowledge was dangerous and shameful. Even after it became legal again, many people never went back to openly practicing these skills. This is why the story of Prohibition and survival skills isn't really about 25 specific tricks. It's about what happens when governments understand that knowledge is power, and that the most efficient way to control behavior isn't to arrest everyone who does it. It's to make people ashamed to share what they know. It's to make them afraid to teach their own families. It's to create a social environment where certain knowledge becomes taboo, not because it's illegal, but because it's surrounded by so much fear that people voluntarily stop passing it on. The survival skills themselves were technical. You could master fermentation in a few months if someone taught you right. You could learn curing and preservation from scratch in a season. But the knowledge of why people did things, the understanding embedded in community practice, the confidence to try and fail and try again, that takes generational transmission. And Prohibition didn't just stop alcohol production. It poisoned the entire ecosystem of knowledge transmission for a generation. Fast forward to today, and we're living with some of the consequences of that break. There are entire categories of practical skills that rural communities understood intuitively 105 years ago that most people today find shocking or suspect. Fermentation is marketed as trendy. Preservation is treated as hobby level. Making things from scratch is positioned as either artisanal luxury or poverty-era desperation, never as normal practical competence. That's partly because between 1920 and 1933, we broke the continuity. The people who knew didn't teach. The young people who might have learned didn't ask. And even after the law changed, the social shame remained. Understanding this angle matters because it reveals something crucial. Laws work through psychology more than through enforcement. You can pass all the regulations you want, but if you understand human fear, human shame, and human social bonds, you can accomplish the same goal without arresting everyone. And conversely, even when the law changes, the psychological damage persists. A law gets repealed, but the generation that was terrified into silence stays silent. Their children never learn because there's no one to teach them. And by the time the grandchildren come around, it's not just about legality anymore. It's about lost knowledge that nobody can quite reconstruct. The Prohibition era teaches us something about the fragility of practical knowledge. It looks robust when it's embedded in millions of people's daily practice. A skill that everyone's grandmother knew, that's hidden in plain sight because it's so normal. But criminalize the practice, make it shameful to teach, and suddenly that distributed knowledge becomes distributed liability. People stop sharing. Knowledge gets hoarded or abandoned, and within a generation, what seemed like common sense becomes exotic. There's another layer to this that we need to address. The government's strategy wasn't even consciously about erasing knowledge at first. It was about something simpler, controlling supply chains and tax revenue. But they quickly realized that criminalization was a more effective tool than they'd anticipated. When you arrest a bootlegger, you disrupt one operation. When you criminalize the knowledge that makes bootlegging possible, you disrupt all future operations by terrifying potential practitioners. And that insight has never left government policymaking. It shows up in different forms across different eras. Whenever there's a skill or a practice that governments want to suppress, they don't always just make it illegal. They make it illegal in ways that are designed to create maximum social fear. They highlight the cases that went wrong. They associate the practice with criminal elements. They make sure there's shame attached to even asking about it. What makes this truly relevant for understanding modern survival knowledge is that we're living in an era where this mechanism is becoming more visible. Not because we're about to criminalize gardening or food preservation, but because we're seeing the same patterns applied to knowledge we're not supposed to have. Information gets suppressed not through direct censorship, but through cultural messaging. Certain skills become associated with survivalism or conspiracy thinking. Parents become afraid to teach their children basic competencies because those competencies have been coded as suspicious. And just like in the Prohibition era, the mechanism is more psychological than legal. This is where you want to look deeper into the psychological and strategic dimensions of how knowledge transmission gets disrupted. There's a full resource in the pinned comment and in the channel description that walks through the specific mechanisms governments and institutions use to break knowledge chains and what you can do about it in your own life and community. The survival value of the Prohibition-era tricks isn't actually about the tricks. It's about understanding how to recognize when knowledge transmission is being attacked. It's about being willing to learn from older people while you still can. It's about recognizing that some of the most valuable information is the stuff that nobody's marketing, nobody's promoting, and nobody's trying to sell you. It's the stuff that scared them enough to criminalize. A grandmother's recipe that she's reluctant to share because she's been trained for 80 years to hide it. A rural skill that seems pointless in modern life but contains principles that could be genuinely useful. The local knowledge of how things actually work in your region, held by people who don't have social media presence and aren't trying to monetize it. That's where the real knowledge is. And understanding how Prohibition worked to suppress that knowledge, understanding the mechanisms, understanding the psychology, that's your defense against similar suppression in other forms. The deepest tragedy of the Prohibition era isn't that people broke the law or that the government enforced it. It's that knowledge that could have continued unbroken across generations got fragmented. Some families passed it on, some didn't. Some held on to it but with shame and secrecy rather than pride and openness. And even now, over 90 years later, you can see the effects. There are skills and understandings that exist in pockets of America, but nowhere else. Knowledge that's documented in old books, but has no living practitioners to show you how the embodied reality actually works. And there are techniques and practices that simply disappeared because nobody was brave enough to keep teaching them. The reason this matters isn't nostalgia. It's not about romanticizing the past or pretending that pre-modern knowledge is automatically superior. It's that practical resilience comes from having multiple approaches, multiple sources of understanding, and the confidence to try things and learn from failure. When a government successfully breaks knowledge transmission chains, it doesn't just erase old ways. It makes people more dependent on single-approved systems. It creates populations that don't know how to problem-solve creatively because they don't have the background knowledge to improvise from. It makes people vulnerable. And that's actually what Prohibition achieved, whether intentionally or not. It didn't just criminalize alcohol production. It criminalized a whole category of hands-on, practical competence. And once you normalize the idea that hands-on knowledge is suspicious, once you make people afraid to share it or learn it, you've created a dependency structure that's beneficial to centralized systems. People who can't make things, preserve things, or fix things become consumers. They become dependent on markets, on supply chains, on approved experts. They become populations that can be controlled more easily. So when we look at the 25 Prohibition-era survival tricks, we're not just looking at historical curiosities. We're looking at flashpoints where the government made a strategic decision about what kinds of knowledge people should have. And we can trace the consequences forward through time. The skills that are rarest today, The ones that seem most exotic or suspicious are often the ones that were most heavily suppressed. And the cultural narratives that make us suspicious of certain kinds of knowledge, those narratives didn't arise accidentally. They were consequences of policies like Prohibition that aimed to control behavior by controlling knowledge transmission. If you want to maintain your own knowledge base, your own capability to understand and do things without external permission or approval, understanding the history of how knowledge suppression works is crucial. And if you want to help preserve knowledge in your own community, understanding the mechanisms that work against that preservation is equally important. Because it's not just about teaching people things. It's about creating conditions where teaching feels safe, where learning feels respected, and where knowledge that doesn't fit commercial systems is still valued and maintained. If you're interested in going deeper into the documented cases where this happened, where specific communities lost specific skills, and what it took to recover them, there's comprehensive research in the description and in the pinned comment that breaks all of this down, with specific examples and citations. The last angle on this that people miss is personal. When you understand that Prohibition was partly about breaking knowledge transmission, you start thinking differently about your own life. You start recognizing elderly people in your life as repositories of information that might not exist anywhere else. You start asking them questions. You start writing things down. You start paying attention to how things are actually done by people who've spent decades learning. And you do this not because everything old is good, but because the diversity of approaches, the understanding of why things work the way they do, the ability to adapt and improvise, those things come from having access to multiple knowledge sources. A grandmother who's been cooking for 60 years doesn't just know recipes, she knows principles. She knows what happens when you improvise. She understands proportions and timing, and how to read whether something's done through senses rather than timers. If she never teaches anyone, if she never writes anything down, if she assumes her knowledge doesn't matter in a modern world of technology and convenience, that knowledge dies, and what replaces it is manufactured convenience that works exactly as long as the system that manufactures it keeps working. And no system works forever. This is why the Prohibition era really matters. It shows us what happens when knowledge suppression works, and it shows us that knowledge suppression doesn't require arresting everyone who has a skill. It just requires making people afraid to share it. It requires creating cultural narratives that make certain knowledge seem suspicious. It requires breaking the generational chains of transmission so completely that even after the law changes, people don't go back to practicing. The good news is that understanding this mechanism also tells you how to resist it. If knowledge suppression works through fear and shame, then maintaining and spreading knowledge requires the opposite: openness, pride in competence, and willingness to teach and learn from people who don't have official credentials or commercial platforms. It requires valuing people for what they actually know how to do, not for what degrees or certifications they hold. It requires creating spaces where practical knowledge is respected, where questions are welcomed, and where failure is understood as part of learning, rather than as proof of incompetence. The Prohibition era shows us what's possible when governments and institutions decide that certain knowledge is threatening, but it also shows us what's possible when communities decide that knowledge matters more than compliance. Because despite everything the government threw at alcohol production during those 13 years, people kept doing it. They got better at hiding it, yes, but they also got more creative about it. They found ways to pass on knowledge even when it was dangerous, and some of those knowledge systems survived intact enough to be recovered and shared openly after Prohibition ended. That resilience, that commitment to preserving knowledge even at personal cost, that's the survival skill that actually matters. That's what kept people from losing everything. Not a specific trick about fermentation or curing or distillation, but the understanding that knowledge itself is survival, and that breaking knowledge transmission chains is how you really control a population. Because a population with no practical knowledge, with no confidence in their own ability to figure things out, with no access to elders who can teach them, that population is truly vulnerable. The 25 survival tricks that became felonies overnight are historically interesting. But the real story is about what happened when people chose knowledge over compliance. What happened when communities decided that keeping information alive mattered more than following rules? What happened when the government learned that criminalizing practices was more effective than trying to prevent them directly? And what we need to learn from all of that today, in our own time, when new forms of knowledge suppression are becoming more sophisticated, more subtle, and more effective. If you want the complete breakdown of all 25 skills, plus the documented cases where knowledge transmission was successfully restored, plus strategic frameworks for protecting knowledge in your own community and time period, check the description and the pinned comment. That resource goes deep into how this works, why it matters, and what you can actually do about it starting today. The fascinating thing about studying history isn't about going backward, it's about understanding patterns. And the pattern of knowledge suppression, the pattern of breaking transmission chains, the pattern of making people ashamed of practical competence, that pattern repeats. Understanding how it worked during Prohibition, understanding the mechanisms and the psychology, gives you tools to recognize it in other forms, in other eras, in your own life and community. And once you recognize it, once you understand how it works, you have the choice to resist it. You have the choice to keep learning. You have the choice to keep teaching. You have the choice to value knowledge that doesn't come from official sources. That choice, that simple decision to stay curious and keep learning from people who actually know how to do things, that might sound small, but if you understand the history of how governments break knowledge transmission, you understand that's actually the most powerful form of resistance, and it's available to all of us, right now. Thanks so much for watching this exploration of how Prohibition suppressed knowledge and broke transmission chains across generations. If this angle on history fascinates you as much as it does me, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss when we explore the next counterintuitive perspective on how the world actually works. Tap the like button to let me know this resonated with you, and activate the notification bell so you're notified the moment new content goes live. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.